Okay, so an example of the pleiotropy is a set of diseases that are called porphyrias. Okay, so an example of that then would be the porphyrias diseases. Um, all of them are caused by uh, an enzyme that is required, that they need to make the iron containing part of the hemoglobin called the heme. Um, and so the enzyme doesn't function properly, and the hemoglobin is not formed properly. But it can vary because it depends on um, how much enzyme is there and how much of it is functioning properly. So you get different diseases, but they're all originating from the same DNA code that's causing the heme, the iron containing part, to malfunction, I guess, or not work properly. So anyway, some of the things that can happen is, you can get blood, or what looks like blood anyway, secreted in the urine. You can have red teeth. Let's see. You could be super sensitive to light. The whole idea of the vampires and stuff like that comes from the fact that these people have what looks like blood in their mouth, but it's not really. It's just that they're not processing the heme right and the hemoglobin right. So anyway, it's called porphyrias, and it manifests totally different with different people, but it all revolves around hemoglobin, and that comes from the enzymes making the heme part of it right. So that's a set of diseases that are an example to the pleiotropy. Okay, genetic heterogeneity. Yeah, I can't say it. Heterogeneity. Yeah, that means that it means the differences in people, the uniqueness, and here we're talking about on this slide the different genes that can produce what we would think of as the same disease. In other words, if somebody loses their hearing, is their hearing loss caused by the same thing? Is everybody who is deaf in the world, did they get deaf in the same way? Definitely not. Some people got rubella and got deaf, and some people were born deaf, and why were they born deaf, etc. So, like, there's different things that contribute to that. So, for the example of hearing loss, like I was talking about, there's at least 132 genetic factors that can go into hearing loss. 132 different forms that cause hearing loss. So if you carry um, one gene for it, or you have both alleles for one of them, you may experience partial hearing loss, you may experience full hearing loss. It all depends. There is a lot involved. But we know of 132 different variations of genes that cause hearing loss. Um, the osteogenesis imperfecta, there's at least two different genes involved in that. Alzheimer's, they've proven 4, they suspect more that genes that can be involved in that. So if you do a genetic profile like I did with 23andMe, and you find that you carry alleles for factors that make you more at risk for something, that the ones, especially like something like 23andMe, they only test for certain ones. Like they test for 2, I think, of the Alzheimer's. They test for the 2 main ones out of the macular degeneration. Now, in the macular degeneration, Then if they test for 2 genes, that means you got 4 alleles involved there. I have 3 out of the 4. Macular degeneration is where you go blind as you get older in the center of your vision. My mom already has that, so I knew that there was a good chance that I had some of those genes. That doesn't mean that will happen to me. It means that those 2 genes are contributing factors. Environment's another contributing factor. I've never been a smoker or a vapor. People that vape, you also have makes genetic changes. So those are things that would be in my favor. But anyway, there's a lot of different genes and environment that influence these things. And all of those things cause us to be totally and completely unique individuals. And yes, the identical twins that you know are also total unique individuals. They may have more genes in common than with other siblings, but they still have had different environmental influences, etc., and are different people. That part of the reason for that then is back to what I was talking about before, that our biochemical pathways are very complicated, and they are pathways. So the enzymes doing the jobs and the proteins involved in the processes, for one thing, they have many jobs, not just one. And for another thing, they're influenced by more than one gene. So there's a lot of complexity involved in the determination of that and the phenotype that comes out of it than what Mendel knew about. So again, the title of that slide, the genetic heterogeneity, that means genetic uniqueness. And then there are things where we assume it's genetic, but really it's environment or a combination of the two. Um, for instance, um, I have a friend that her mom, her dad, and her sister all developed cancer. So that would suggest that, and ultimately died from it. And it would suggest that, hey, there's a genetic factor here. Let's go get the genes checked. When in reality, when they traced back, they realized that after the older kids moved out, the family lived near a power plant with a lot of electricity and a lot of power, and they said that that could have just as easily caused a change in DNA that would trigger the cancer as genetics. Now, which one actually happened, I don't know because they didn't all go get the genetics checked. But, and it could have been something even totally different than that. It could have been something they ate, um, maybe something the three of them liked that the rest of the family didn't, and it could be anything. Or maybe the rest of the family will develop cancer eventually. But in any rate, if it looks like it might be genetic, but it's got environmental factors in it, phenocopy is the name for that. Remember that members within a family, um, yes, they share the same genes or some of the same genes, but they also oftentimes share the same environment. So environmental factors can also play a part in that. They probably contracted similar diseases because once one catches it, the other people in the family catch it. Um, could be radiation exposure, could be radon in their basement, it could be many different things, but they're all living in practically the same environment, and therefore it could have been that influence as well. And like I said, it can also be a combination of the environment. Most often is a combination of the environment and the genes. So here are a couple of examples. Exposure to teratogens. Teratogens are anything that causes a change, um, specifically in fetal development, but as in other words, if the pregnant woman were exposed during pregnancy, then the changes to the fetus. So if they had some kind of birth defect, you think, oh, well, that was a genetic thing. Well, it could have been that you were exposed and you didn't even realize you were exposed to something. Other examples of that would be like sexually transmitted diseases, um, or any disease really that transfers from mother to child. So it looks like, oh, the mother had it and the child had it, it must be genetic. When in reality, it was the mother who gave it to the child during childbirth. So those are examples where some kind of environmental factor has muddied the waters for genetic study. So you have to be very aware of everything involved, just like they taught us in elementary school, how you only manipulate one variable at a time and you control all other variables. And that's very difficult to do in a genetic study when you're dealing with people living their lives. When you're younger and you're learning about genetics, you learn that the DNA is in the nucleus, and it is, but there's also DNA in the mitochondria. And what is the mitochondria's job? Most people probably said that it's the powerhouse of the cell because that's kind of the catchphrase, which it is, but what does that mean? What does it do? It produces the energy that that cell needs. So the mitochondria is extremely important because it's got to produce all the energy for that cell. So therefore, it actually has some DNA as well. Um, it has a short, round, circular, it kind of goes around in the mitochondria, so it's kind of a roundish shape. And it only has 37 genes on it because the job of the mitochondrial DNA, which by the way is abbreviated with the lowercase m and the lowercase t in front of it to show, excuse me, that that's in the mitochondria, not in the nucleus. Anyway, it has 37 genes, and pretty much their entire job is to create energy for the cell and ultimately for the organism. So that's why it only needs 37 genes. It's totally focused on just that. Now, there are some differences because of the mitochondrial DNA. There's no crossing over to it, and it can't really repair itself. Maybe a little, but not much. So those two things somewhat offset each other. There are mutations, but not huge mutations caused by crossing over. But there are little mutations that get through, and a lot more of the mutations get through because there's less repair being done. I remember when I was in school, and that really blew my mind. What do you mean there's DNA outside of the nucleus? It's in the nucleus. That's what I've always learned. There is, and it is. The DNA that codes to make you a whole human being is in the nucleus. But there's an extra little bit in the mitochondria that's giving you the energy you need. Okay, so since that mitochondrial DNA has a different job than the actual nuclear DNA, then you come about it in a little bit different way. For instance, the theory is that all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. Now, I just read an article recently that they think that maybe they have a situation where some came from the father. I'm not saying that can never happen because I don't know what's going on right now in research, but we have always believed up till this point that all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother, and the mitochondrial diseases um, seem to suggest that that is true. There's always little differences, and maybe 1 to 10,000 cells. Maybe you got some from your dad. I don't know. But for right now, what they're telling us is all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mom. So that's what we'll go with. What that means then is if there is a mitochondrial disorder in there and mom has it, it's going to go to every one of her kids. So you can see there in the pedigree 1-2 has the trait, and every single one of her kids has the trait. And then it passes from the mom to the kids again in the third generation, but not from the boys because they don't give their mitochondrial DNA to their kids. So it would only pass through the females. So if the mom has it and the son has it, the son's kids are not going to have it. It's only the daughter's kids that it would pass on to. So you should be able to see that between, in this pedigree, between generations 2 and 3, only the women passed it on. Now, if we go back to what you know about cells, there's not just one mitochondria in your cell, there's thousands of them. So within those thousands of mitochondria are chromosomes or DNA. And so there's lots of these. And yeah, let me just put this on here. So this mitochondrial DNA may seem like kind of an afterthought or an outside thing, or does, not so important. But in reality, there is a lot of that DNA there because there's a lot of mitochondria there. Sorry, my foot. It's killing me.